Ja. Så, hej alle sammen. Så vi er Mad in America, Mad in Denmark er vi. Yeah. So, Bob, I'll just do an intro in Danish, and then yeah. So, bare lidt af det praktisk. Lidt af det praktisk. Vi vil på her, når Bob skal tale, bede jer om at slukke jeres videoer og mikrofoner. Bodil, hun styrer chatten. Vi vil gerne bede jer om, hvis I har et spørgsmål i chatten, at I skriver med blokbogstaver spørgsmål og kolon, fordi så er det lidt nemmere at finde der. Til sidst, Bob vil tale i en cirka 45 minutter, og så er det åbent til spørgsmål, diskussion her, og det vil være så håndsoprækning der, og vi vil gerne derefter bede jer om selvfølgelig, at jeres video er på, når I spørger og sådan noget. Yes. Godt. Now I'm going to go into English because it's going to be in English. Just want to introduce this is our Mad in Denmark team. We've existed for how long?
2 years.
2 years, yeah. 2 years. So
3.
yeah, so we've been around a while, and we're a pretty good team, we think, don't we? And we're hoping, we want this to be sort of our first video, our launching a little bit into the video world, and also to inspire you guys to know that we exist. If you feel like contributing, writing, anything, well, you are more than welcome. Also, if you don't want to write, but you've seen a good story or something, you can always write to us and say, hey, please take notice that there's something really interesting going on. And I have just to say my connection to Bob, because I've been part of Mad in America. In fact, I think since it started, really, haven't I, Bob? Pretty much, yes.
Yes.
How many years is
Been
that?
on the board ever since it started.
Yeah. So, and then it's been this idea of having the Mad-ins in all over the world, and now we're getting more and more in different countries. So we've really expanded. Well, Bob, you're going to come in on what's happening about all the Mad-ins and the Mad in the world. But Bob and I have known each other for many, many years. I remember the first time I got to hear about you was reading your book, that Mad in America. And I was at that time, I'd come out of psychiatry, and I was searching for something that could make sense of something I knew was fundamentally wrong and off. And, and I was just thinking, I must be crazy because I think psychiatry's gone completely wrong. Then I found your book, and I remember I read it through in one go, and I thought, oh my God. And then I went back and read it again, this time going to all the references, and I discovered it was like this world opened up for me. It was amazing. And you're basically the only author I've ever really wanted to meet. And so when we got that opportunity to bring you to Denmark, that was it. And then we started a friendship many, many years ago. Yeah, and now we have Mad in Denmark as part of the Mad in the world. So it's a huge, huge privilege that you can speak to all of us here today. And yeah, we're looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be here. It's inspiring to be here. Of course, I'm thrilled about what's going on with Mad in Denmark. And I do have to say, Olga and I have been friends for a long time. She's one of my dearest friends in the world. So any chance I have a chance to be with her is a great day. And
same here.
She has been a model of inspiration for us, and I think for many people in many countries. So it's just an honor and a pleasure to be here today. So what they asked me to speak about was sort of the history of the movement and how we ended up where we are today, going through this Mad in the World organization. Now, in a way, the first part of this is going
sorry,
to be.
sorry to interrupt, just want to say, would you prefer that some people keep their videos going, or do you want to just because otherwise it gives the people the opportunity to make you big, because you can go in and change the view up in your right-hand corner. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine for me.
Good.
It's perfectly
Good.
fine for me because I
Good.
have
Yeah.
what I want to view. So whatever you all want to view is good for me.
Super. We'll just keep it going at that. Great.
Okay,
Sorry.
great. Well, I just want to say especially the first part of this is of course going to be a little bit US centric, because I know how the sort of movement, the history of the movement better in the United States than it was, say, like in Europe and all. So if you look at the history of in the United States, the sort of peer-led movement really was a psychiatric survivor movement, and it began to arise in the late 1960s, early 1970s. But you have to understand it was part of the people who were leading this psychiatric survivor movement, people like Leonard Roy Frank, David Oakes, and other people. They saw themselves as oppressed in the same way that, say, Black human beings were being oppressed in the United States forever. So, for example, I know this may seem odd, but until the Civil Rights Act of 1965, I think it was, Black people really had a hard time voting in many states of the country. They really had been denied the right to vote in much of the South. And there were other sort of legal standards that prevented them from having citizenship rights. And what happened was, coming out of the asylums in the late 1960s and early 1970s were people who felt that first of all, they'd been forcibly treated, they had been forcibly hospitalized, and they felt they had been harmed by that experience. And so when they came out, they basically were saying, we should have the right to be the authors of our own lives. We survived psychiatry. In other words, we saw it as a harmful experience, but we managed to transcend that. And they formed groups like the Network Against Psychiatric Assault. They saw drugs as assaultive. They saw electroshock as assaultive. And they did everything from holding protests at the annual American Psychiatric Association meeting. They organized themselves into legislative efforts. So, for example, in California, for a time, they did succeed in banning electroshock. It was interesting when you saw their protests, they would carry signs like hugs, not drugs. So it was very much, it wasn't in any way a sort of soft rejection of psychiatry. It was a full rejection of psychiatry that likened themselves to people who had their civil rights violated, and that those who were forcibly treating them and treating them with drugs that made them feel like zombies. It was in that context. It wasn't a soft context. It was we're in full rebellion against how we're being treated. And that gave it a real authority and a real integrity, in my opinion. Now, interesting, this is a bit of a side note. There was a congressional hearing in 1973, I think it was, in which they were looking at the use of antipsychotics to control kids. Okay, and to control behaviors, and also just basically to control behaviors, that sort of thing, in kids in juvenile delinquency settings, that sort of thing. And it was really interesting what happened there. Oh, and also, by the way, at this time, American Psychiatric Association was criticizing Russia, the Soviet Union, for using antipsychotics to torture dissidents. Okay, because they knew that if you gave Haldol at a high enough dose, and by the way, we were using really high doses of Haldol in this time, you could torture them with feelings of akathisia, dyskinesia, motor inability to move, that sort of thing. So they condemned the Soviet use of antipsychotics for torturing dissidents. But the point I'm making here is, the psychiatric survivors saw themselves as dissidents to the powers that be. But what Congress said and psychiatry said, oh, if you give it to people with the disease, schizophrenia, then it's curative. And we don't want anything that would threaten our use of drugs for that. But yeah, it's terrible when you torture people with these drugs. But you can see the split mind that was going on here within the halls of Congress, that somehow a drug that could torture people in Russia could be helpful to people in the United States, even though there were psychiatric survivors who testified that these drugs were being used to in essence, torture them in asylums. So that was a real strong movement, and it had a place in the United States because it tied in with the civil rights movement. So that gave it some authority and that sort of thing. Then there was a famous book, On Our Own. Who was on our, oh God. Written in 1978 by one of the leaders, and I can't believe I'm missing her name right now, but that was sort of the book that said, do you know
Chamberlain?
Olga? Yes, thank you. And that was sort of the book that put the stake in the ground, saying, we're going to make our own world, okay? And it was really, we need to be independent. We don't want anything to do with psychiatry. And there was a movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, at this time that really captured some of that sense. I think you probably know this movie in Denmark. And the thing was, it treated the psychiatrists and the mental health professionals as crazier than the patients. And that was sort of a sentiment that in the 1960s and 1970s that did take hold within a larger part of the population, and particularly those that might identify with the left, okay? What we call the left. We don't really have much of a left, but anyway. So then 1980 comes. And 1980 really is a critical moment, even for the psychiatric survivor movement or the peer-led movement, because what is going to happen after this, that whole movement's going to splinter. It really is, and in many ways, it's going to weaken. Oh, by the way, and one group that really transcended this time was Mind Freedom, which was led by David Oakes. They published a newsletter that was absolutely adamant against forced treatment, and it still exists. So 50 years of campaigning against forced treatment. It's really admirable what Mind Freedom has done over 5 decades. But what happened in 1980 was this. The American Psychiatric Association publishes the 3rd edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, in the 1970s, if you would have asked Americans what causes psychiatric difficulties, you would have got different answers. There would have been some people that said, oh yeah, there's some biology maybe with some people. Others would say, oh, it's Freudian, there's unconscious things and it's a lack of adjustment to a world. Others say it's a sane reaction to an insane world. In other words, that there were social factors. And so there was a general sense that so often it is a societal reaction. I mean, it's a reaction to environments that are not helpful, family environments, social environments, poverty, racism, that sort of thing. And in that, by the way, going back to the 1970s, in that way of understanding things, there was a wholesale rejection of drugs. So among the psychiatric survivor leaders, once they got out, they just quit the drugs. And that became actually part of the sense of freedom. It's not having to live within this, under the sort of influence of drugs, okay? So, but 1980 comes along, and what the American Psychiatric Association does is it says, we're going to reconceive of mental disorders. And what we're going to say is that they're diseases of the brain. The problem is inside the individual's head, and it's not in these spaces. It's not in society. Society is not doing things. Families aren't doing any things. It's not a reaction really to social conditions, okay? But it's a defect in your brain. Now, there was no scientific discovery that enabled that reconception of psychiatric disorders. It was done because, in fact, in the 1970s, with the rise of the psychiatric survivor movement, and by the way, an anti-psychiatry movement in academia that said psychiatry functions more as an agency of social control than as an agency of medicine. What happened is in the 1970s, psychiatry said, oh, we're under siege. Okay, because our patients don't like us, There's this academic calling us anti-psychiatry, say we're not real doctors. Their form of talk therapy, psychoanalysis, was not seen as any better than other forms of talk therapy, but much more expensive. So they were losing their dominant place in the therapeutic marketplace. So you had all these things coming together, and they talked about being under siege. There was a famous article by a psychologist, David Rosenhan, where he and 7 other psychologists presented themselves at mental institutions, mental hospitals, and said they were hearing a single word, thud. They were all admitted. They were diagnosed as having schizophrenia. And what was really interesting in the article was they were never seen as identified as imposters by the psychiatrists or the mental health professionals, but the patients did identify them as imposters. Okay, and this was such a blow to their credibility when this paper was published that a week later, the American Psychiatric Association said, we're under siege. Our future is at stake. We need to rebrand ourselves. And basically they said, we need to rebrand ourselves as doctors in white coats, because doctors in white coats have such influence and prestige in our society. So that was the real roots of DSM-3 was, we're going to get rid of the couch, the shrink stroking his beard, talking to someone on the couch, and we're going to put on a white coat, and we're going to, in essence, adopt an antibiotic model of disease, that we have drugs that treat something that's wrong in the brain. And we start hearing about chemical imbalances, that sort of thing. Now, what happened when this story was first marketed in the United States? They began doing PR campaigns to change our thinking, our societal thinking, and accept this chemical imbalance story. And by the way, the chemical imbalance story fit into a larger narrative of great progress. They discovered the very molecules that cause schizophrenia, the very molecule that caused depression. And now when Prozac arrives, we say in 1987, we have a drug that fixes that chemical imbalance, like insulin for diabetes. This is a story of great medical progress. It fits into that larger history of medical progress in the 20th century, like the discovery of insulin for diabetes, the vaccines, that sort of thing, antibiotics. So it was successfully basically sold to the American public, okay? And that began to diminish the strength of the psychiatric survivor movement, because the psychiatric survivor movement had this influence, this hold on the American mind, because it did fit what we know about oppressed groups, okay? And and about a powerful group that does oppression to a less powerful group. And that we all knew that social conditions could cause you to become miserable. And we also did understand at this time that, family stresses can be pretty problematic too, okay? But along with this new one was, families couldn't be at fault. Society can't be at fault. It's the fault of the individual. And as that becomes known, the sort of psychiatric survivor cry becomes muted, okay? Because we no longer have the social context that supports a group of people saying, we don't want to be oppressed by this oppressive government. And then we got this movement in the United States that really was, it had two sort of impulses, good and bad. What happened is psychiatry adopted this sense of a recovery movement. Now, there was people, former leaders of the psychiatric survivor movement, the National Empowerment Center, that were promoting a recovery movement as well. And it seemed like an advance, because under the old ideas, sometimes it was like, oh, you're going to be chronically ill. And now they were saying, well, with the drugs that fix your brain, like insulin for diabetes, you can sort of recover and be stable, okay? But taking drugs is going to be, at least as it's pitched to the people of the United States, that's going to be central to the recovery movement, because the drugs are seen as what helps you remain stable and sort of live in society. Now, look at the wording. It's recovery movement. It's not that you're recovered, okay? So it was a message saying that you're never really going to be normal or okay. So it's still isolating people. Now, the other thing that happened during this 80s and 90s that began to weaken the psychiatric survivor movement was institutions that were providing services, particularly outpatient services, but sometimes inpatient, began to hire peers to be involved in providing care, okay, as part of their team. But the peers in some ways became co-opted and were expected to give a message that you need to take your drugs. And often that included the people who were working in those situations. Now, I'm saying what is happening in the United States. I don't want to say I know what's happening in Denmark and Europe. That's what was happening in the United States. So we saw this weakening of the recovery movement throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And as that happened, by the way, once we began to believe that, oh, psychosis resides in the head of the individual, and the drugs fix that psychosis because it's due to too much dopamine and the drugs block dopamine, that became a message for society to force people, even after leaving the hospital, to take antipsychotics, okay, if they wanted to get any sort of social support services, etc. So that was a big switch as well. If we're going back to 1970s, in fact, I was once at a meeting, a meeting at NARPA. NARPA is the national, it's basically a group that brings together lawyers and psychiatric survivors to fight forced treatment. And I was at a meeting, I think in around 2000, and there were a group of old psychiatric survivors with some newer people. And what was really interesting was the talk around the drugs. The older people said, hey, we just got out, we quit the drugs. Okay, we just said the hell with it, we threw out the drugs and we went on with our lives. The newer people were talking about how difficult it was tough to come off the drugs, perhaps because they had lived them longer, and how you had to need to take 1 or 2 years to do so. I'm just saying, interestingly enough, the talk about withdrawal changed rather dramatically as we moved into the recovery type movement. Now, I just want to say, so from my point of view, the recovery movement is a double-edged sword. In some hands, it's good, but somehow it takes away some of the energy with a real sort of, we need a fight against this prevailing paradigm. But there are some other things that happened during the 80s and 90s that are going to get eventually, that are going to originate in Europe and are going to come back in and start revitalizing the dialogue in the United States. Oh, by the way, for example, one of the, and Olga, you can speak to this, but for example, one of the organizations, psychiatric survivor organizations with the longest history is We Shall Overcome in Norway, which started in 1968. And We Shall Overcome is in exactly what was the Black population where leaders were talking about when they were fighting for their civil rights in the 1960s. So you definitely see a civil rights movement in Norway. And I know there were critical psychiatry groups that were starting to form in different European countries as well. Anyway, there's two things that I think the roots, I know one of the roots go to the 90s, but I think hearing voices goes all the way back to the 90s too, right, Dolga? So there are two things. There's open dialogue in Finland that really is rethinking things conceptually. And there's hearing voices that's really rethinking things conceptually. And after 2000, these are going to be examples of an interchange between the US and other groups where we learn, where in the United States, sort of peer-led groups glom on to things that are coming from Europe and saying, we need to do these here. And so the hearing voices movement, for example, took off. Okay, so this brings us, we first have the pre-1980 time. Then we have this time to 1980 to 2000 when the whole pathologizing of people, what the disease model is happening, and you get this great expansion in the United States and in the number of people who are diagnosed. We diagnose our kids, the number of people medicated, and this becomes our new sort of social philosophy. And initially, by the way, a lot of European psychiatry thought this was idiotic. If you go back to the 1980s, especially with the kids. But what happened was, first of all, the American Guild is very powerful just because of the financial influences. The pharmaceutical company is very powerful. Pharmaceutical companies began paying American doctors to be their thought leaders, to author their trials, to run continuing medical education courses, to be their speakers at that sort of thing. So because they understood academic psychiatrists helped create a narrative that society would accept that maybe the pharmaceutical companies wouldn't accept. And then what happened is, if you were to go to the annual APA meeting in like the year 2000, 2001, half the people would be from Europe and Asia and South America. And they were coming there on with money, with grants from the pharmaceutical industry. They began hearing about all these great advances in care, the chemical imbalances, the whole biological disease story. And now they go back to their country, and many of them began to receive money from the pharmaceutical industry. So, for example, there was a meeting in Berlin in 2002 where something like every seminar was the World Congress of Psychiatry, something like that. Virtually every seminar speaker was getting money from the drug companies. We're talking about European psychiatrists. So they had a model for exporting this model of care. And obviously we saw that the chemical imbalance story began to spread around the world, and the medicating of kids. You're not doing it like we are in the United States, but still you're medicating your kids in a way you weren't doing 35 years ago, 40 years ago. Okay, now here's my entry into this world. So, and this is going to lead to Mad in the World and how we ended up here. So in 1998, and I had been writing for newspapers for a long time, some magazine work, but then I also spent 4 years as director of publications at Harvard Medical School. I left journalism work, went to Harvard Medical School because I needed to make some money, and I had kids heading towards college, and I had no money. But this was during a time that everybody was talking about evidence-based medicine. We have to practice evidence-based medicine because doctors can be deluded about their merits of their therapies. Anyway, what happened like in the 1990s, so what happened is, in addition to being director of publications, I started a publication, co-founded a publication called Center Watch. We looked at the business of clinical trials of new drugs, okay, about paying, how pharmaceutical companies pay doctors to conduct their trials, and then they pay them to put their names on the studies. Then they pay them to promote the drugs. I began writing about that, and I began writing about how it was corrupting the clinical trials of new drugs. And psychiatry was the best example of this because the corruption was fullest. And so I went to the Boston Globe, who I'd written for before, and said, I want to do a series about the abuse of psychiatric patients in research settings. And one of the abuses was in these commercial trials, they take people diagnosed with schizophrenia on the drugs and yank them off abruptly, and half would be put on the drug they had been on and half would be remained on placebo. And they'd say, see, the placebo group has worse outcomes. And that was the evidence for the efficacy of the drugs, both short-term and long-term. But obviously that's a form of abuse to the patients. Anyway, nevertheless, at this time, I had a conventional understanding of science. I did believe in the chemical imbalance story because that's what I was told when I called people up. And they said, oh yeah, the antipsychotics block dopamine. Schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine, and therefore the drugs are like insulin for diabetes. And interestingly, in this series for the Boston Globe, one of the abuses we said were studies where they had withdrawn people with diagnosed with schizophrenia from their antipsychotics because we said, well, that's unethical. If the drugs are like insulin for diabetes, you wouldn't withdraw insulin from a diabetic to see if he became sick again. So I believed in that narrative, okay? So I'm on that side. Here is how I began to question that narrative. I called up David Oakes, who was the president of Mind Freedom, and I wanted to get a quote about how awful it was. By the way, I knew nothing really much about the psychiatry at this point, that they had run studies where they had withdrawn people from antipsychotics. And I expected him to say, yeah, that's awful. They would never do this to other people. They only do it to us because we're poor and they don't care. He said, oh, no, those studies suck because of the way they're being abruptly withdrawn and what they're being used for. But we hate these drugs. They make us feel like zombies. We want to be free from these medications. Now, that was and he said this. he said, you know, there is evidence that these drugs shrink the brain. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, I'll send you a link to a document, and you need to do two things. You need to investigate what people who are placed on these medications think about them. And then you should investigate what science is telling us about how these drugs act on the brain. So now this is a little bug in my ear. And now here's one thing that's really important. There is an old adage in journalism that your job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So there is a moment now is like, well, maybe I shouldn't just be listening to what these psychiatrists are telling me. And then I came upon two other studies that really made me doubt the conventional narrative. One was studies by Harvard researchers who reported that long-term outcomes from schizophrenia patients had worsened in the last 30 years, not improved. That was a counter the narrative of progress. And were now no better than they had been in the first third of the 20th century, which is remembered as a horrible time. And then there were these cross-cultural studies, two studies by the World Health Organization, which compared outcomes for people with schizophrenia diagnosed in 3 developing countries, India, Colombia, Nigeria, versus US and 6 other developed countries. Denmark was one of the developed countries, by the way, in these studies. And they twice found that outcomes were much, much better in the developing countries. So much so, they wrote, the World Health Organization investigates, that living in a developed country is a strong predictor that you won't have a good outcome if you're diagnosed with schizophrenia. So after the first such study, the investigators hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is they're more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotics regularly, which is a belief that makes sense if you believe the drugs are so key to long-term outcomes and they're fixing something chemically wrong or pathologically wrong. So they measured antipsychotic use in the second study, which I think was 2 years in length. And here's what they found. The outcomes were best in the 2 countries, India and Nigeria, that used the drugs acutely but not chronically. Acutely meaning for a short period of time, but they didn't maintain their patients on the drugs. And then the outcomes were worst among all the countries in the country that did the best at making sure all of its patients were on the drugs, and that was the Soviet Union. So now, here again, I was a believer. You needed to take these drugs long-term. Oh, by the way, I was told if patients didn't want to take them, it's because they lacked insight into their illness. They had anosognosia. And when I called people up about that, they said, oh, it's anosognosia. I also heard this is the power for talking about the powerless and robbing them of any agency of their own lives. So anyway, I got a contract to write Mad in America. And I did so really, first of all, the understanding of why are outcomes so poor for people diagnosed with schizophrenia in developed countries when supposedly we're making all this progress. Anyway, it's a book that talks about how the, quote, seriously mentally ill have been treated in the United States from colonial times up until today. And it's really a counter narrative to the conventional narrative of history. And one of the ways it's a counter narrative is at every stage of that time, I tried to include writings or statements from people who were being treated. And what you find when you do that is a long history where psychiatry and society is telling one story of a sort of benevolent psychiatry that then in 1955 gets drugs and makes this great psychopharmacological advance. So that's one narrative. And it's sort of a narrative of, a history of medicine that makes psychiatry look okay and even good. And then there's this counter narrative. And in this counter narrative is of people who are being identified as the other. They're being locked up so often. They're being mistreated, that sort of thing. And when the mistreatment happens, such as forced sterilization, electroshock, lobotomies, that was seen as good for these people. And there's a whole story about like how we conceive of people that we are seen as having, a quote, the insane is so key to the treatments that follow. So there was a time where the Quakers in the early 1800s said, we don't know what causes insanity. We just know they're brethren. We need to treat them as brethren. and they built a retreat where out in nature, and they thought that nature could be healing, good meals could be healing, dressing up, reading, dressing up in ordinary clothes. And they, by far, if you go back in history, look at their case reports, they've had by far the best outcomes. So anyway, this is a counter narrative. And then in particular, from the moment, and I talk about the eugenics movement, which is never mentioned in the conventional histories, because the eugenics movement is when we say, oh, these people have a genetic defect, and that's why they shouldn't be allowed to have kids. There was even calls to kill the mentally ill. It started in the United States, of course, Germany. Its Holocaust begins with killing of the mentally ill. But then what I told the history was that the psychopharmacology era, instead of being an era of progress, really is in line with sort of the abuses of the past, forced hospitalization. And when they get information about their own drugs that show that they're making people worse, they hide that information. Because believe it or not, with the antipsychotics, very early on, the first NIM research showed, oh, we are causing a biological change that makes people more biologically vulnerable to relapse and to more severe relapses. You see functional rates beginning to decline with the introduction of antipsychotics. So it's a counter history, okay? And it's one that I think, what I was proud of, it honored the voice of those who've been treated and honored them as a voice that could be reliable. They were reliable authors of their own lives. And by the way, there's a famous quote once, two famous quotes. One is about a man, a writer who gets hospitalized in the 19th century. He goes, they called me mad and I called them mad, and then they outvoted me, which I thought was a good line about the power. But then there was also, you also saw, oh, I forget the name of the historian, said, if you look at the history of madness and you try to see where does reason lie, which group is a more authentic relator of what's going on, they said it really lies with the mad and not with the providers. So there was that sense that this counter narrative that I was telling in Mad Narrative was actually a much more authentic, accurate history than the conventional histories of psychiatry. Well, you can imagine that was not greeted well by the powers that be in society. One of my favorite reviews was, he used to be a good journalist, now he looks like he's a member of Scientology, stuff like that. There were other reviews that were good, though. It wasn't only bad. It was just from psychiatry, really, that I really got crushed. But my agent at this time said to me, Bob, don't ever write about this again. It's too controversial. If you want to save your career as a writer, write about other things. Which I did. I wrote 2 other books. But something else happened with Mad in America. And that is, I was rescued by really the peer movement, the psychiatric survivor movement. They sort of embraced me. They said, this was our story. Thank God someone actually told our story. And I began being invited to their conferences. And so I really felt that my career as a writer was saved by psychiatric survivor groups who said, thank you for telling our story. So anyway, you know, I do write a couple other books because it was pretty brutal in many ways, because even I lost friendships. My poor kids had their friends were psychiatrists who said, we don't want that guy in our house anymore, stuff like that. So it was sort of a tough time. But people were asking me then, well, where are all the bipolar patients coming from in the United States? Because all of a sudden we were getting this huge expansion of bipolar patients. And what's happening to the kids? Why are we getting so kids that are diagnosed with ADHD? And so what I did with Anatomy of an Epidemic, it was 2 things. I was trying to investigate sort of a conundrum. According to the conventional narrative, we were making great progress in diagnosing and treating mental disorders of all types. And yet, if you looked at the disability data, it was soaring, the number of people on disability due to mental disorders. So that raised a conundrum. Why, if we have this scientific advance, are we seeing that the burden of mental disorders as measured by disability numbers is rising? Okay. And what I did in that book is 2 things. One, I looked at in detail, the origins of the chemical imbalance story shown how it never really panned out. Not never really, never panned out. Early on, it didn't pan out. And looked at how the drugs actually act on the brain. And what they do, of course, is they perturb normal functioning of the neurotransmitter systems. In response to that perturbation, your brain goes through this compensatory adaptation, trying to maintain what's called a homeostatic equilibrium. And the irony is, the drugs induce the very problems that were hypothesized, or very abnormally hypothesized to cause the problems in the first place. So you can see how this was such a threat to the conventional narrative. And then the second part of the book looked at this question. Okay, we do these trials over the short term to see how effective the drugs are, and they beat placebo to some degree. But what is happening to people over the long term? And when you raise this question, you immediately ask another question that is so important. What is the natural capacity to recover in nature? Because with the chemical imbalance story, the disease model, they eliminate the thought you can ever get better in nature. It's a permanent problem. And you want to see, well, is a psychotic episode, does it foretell of a chronic course? It doesn't, okay? An initial psychotic episode. And what you can see with so many of these disorders, that they're episodic in kind, and that's what they were understood to be until we got this psychopharmacology era. That includes, by the way, manic depressive illness. Okay, they include depression. And of course, we didn't even have ADHD before 1980. And what you find now, with that as the foil, are we improving on the natural capacity to recover? What you find again and again, and what is key here is this is in their own literature, their own scientific studies. It's not coming from a complaint by psychiatric survivor. It's coming from their own findings in studies funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, not by the drug industry. And what you find is a clear history, starting with the antipsychotics. They're introduced. The first study finds that, our relapse rates are now getting higher and our social functioning is going downhill. Then you get 3 studies in the 1970s that look at long-term outcomes, that compare unmedicated outcomes for people with psychotic schizophrenia diagnosis to medicated. Each case, the unmedicated group had better outcomes. Then you actually hear American psychiatrists say, oh, maybe we're making cause a biological change that makes people worse. Canadian investigators say, we think we know what's happening. The drugs block dopamine, and in response, your brain creates this extra dopamine receptors, and that's leading to tardive persistent psychosis. Then we get the cross-cultural studies. We get MRI studies that tell us this. Yes, these drugs shrink the brain over the first year in particular. And as that happens, you get a diminishment of functional, you get increase in negative symptoms, a worsening of cognitive function, and more functional impairment. That's a sign of an iatrogenic injury. Then we had the best longitudinal study ever done by Martin Harrell, published in 2007, in which he found that the recovery rate for those people with schizophrenia, diagnosed in the 1970s and early 1980s, long-term recovery rate was 8 times higher for those off medication. So this was research now that belied the conventional story about antipsychotics. It's the same way you chart the same thing with antidepressants. It turned from an antidepressant disorder to a chronic one. Same thing, bipolar outcomes worsened dramatically, even acknowledged by experts. The study we did of long-term ADHD outcomes, it was worse for the medicated kids. So you see that what we have is a paradigm of care that while some people say I'm doing fine on these medications, they help me, et cetera, in the aggregate, they increase the chronicity of symptoms, they increase functional impairment, and they increase disability rates. So this was a real clarion call saying if we want to look at this evidence-based psychiatry, we need to make changes because on the whole, in the aggregate, we're causing harm. And then in the final part of the book, I just looked at the financial influences, guild influences, and pharmaceutical influences that were the reason American psychiatry told us a false narrative of science about chemical imbalances and hid all this information that threatened their conventional narrative. So what happened when I wrote this? Well, 5 minutes after the book was published, there's a date when they can start reviewing it. A review appeared on the Boston Globe, my hometown newspaper, that likened me to a South African dictator who, by virtue of denying AIDS, had caused hundreds of thousands of people to die, and this book was dangerous in that vein. Now, this was my fourth book. Just to say something, I had all my previous books won sort of some sort of national recognition, okay? Which means I should have gotten reviews. All my reviews, no more reviews. The reviews were canceled. My radio things were canceled. And I was labeled as a conspiracy theorist because this was so against the narrative we had organized our thinking around. How was I saved again? Two groups. Once again, it was peer groups, okay? Psychiatric survivor groups, other peer groups embraced it. And then there was a small group of open-minded providers, psychologists, some psychiatrists that began to say, listen, this is our research and we really need to think about this. And that was the beginning of a crack opening, okay? Oh, and by the way, in that book, I talked about open dialogue and how with their selective use model in Finland, they were getting much better outcomes, and I did other solutions of this type. So, and now, how did we get to Mad in the World? Well, after that book, it became obvious to me, well, what happened really was a couple of people began to say, we would like to write. I had a blog. I had a, always when you need a new book at this time, you're supposed to have a blog. I had a Mad in America blog writing about new studies, that sort of thing. And two people came forward, said, well, to talk to me about what might be done. And I said, why don't you write for Mad in America? One was Laura Delano, who, as many of you might know, has a new book out called Unshrunk. And the other was a physician who wanted to stop prescribing these drugs. And once that opened, I began hearing from other people about, hey, we really need to have a discussion about this. And so I said, what I'll do is and I did this with Kermit Cole and Louisa Putnam and Olga. We founded Mad in America with the idea that we'd make a news magazine. And what would the news magazine be? We'd have personal stories by people with lived experience, because you can't rethink psychiatry without listening to the voice of those with, lived experience who are being treated. So we had personal experiences, personal stories. We have now published more than 600 personal stories. I think we have the largest archive of personal stories you find anywhere, and people even use them for research purposes. Then we would say we would have daily science reports, because the science that tells of this failed paradigm of care, they're never promoted to the public. They're hidden. So I said, we will become a media forum for making this information known. Then I would say we would write about initiatives, that alternatives, the results, experiments, that sort of thing, and help promote those in the United States and abroad. And so, for example, one of the things we promoted really early was hearing voices. Hearing voices really didn't have a place in the United States in 2010. Now it's everywhere. But we were part of the promotion of that. The other group that was really part of the promotion, other than, it came from the peer movement itself, was I helped found something called the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care. They got money to give grants to support things like the development of hearing voices networks and to do research into the long-term outcomes. So they supported further analysis by Thomas Harrow and Martin Harrow and Thomas Job, who did that long-term study. And they gave some money to help support the development of open dialogue in European countries. So that's where Mad in America, why we did it. And we called it Mad in America after my first book. We saw it as a global forum. And even before we started having these affiliates, we were getting readers for 1 year, like from 190 countries, which did tell us that there was a grassroots interest in challenging this conventional paradigm that was arising throughout the world. Okay, and in opposition to this conventional narrative. In 2014, we had a Mad America Film Festival, which also helped us understand, because we had films coming from other countries. I think we had films from 8 other countries. That was a sign that, really, we can do more of a collective voice here. Mad in Sweden followed up. Sweden followed up with a Mad in Sweden Film Festival 2 years later. And I believe it was at that festival I met two women from Spain who said, we would like to start a Mad in Spain. Hadn't really thought about it before. We said, oh, that's a great idea. Now, we initially thought about that as a Spanish-speaking site, not a Mad in Spain, but sort of a speak for the Spanish-speaking population. But very quickly, we also began to hear, like, from people in Latin America, it's like, we don't really, Spain is different. They're the colonizers. So they wanted their own ability to have sites. And then it just began, once Mad in Spain started, we now had a way, sort of a model for letting what we would do, how we would work with other affiliate sites. And the way we work with them, as all of you at Mad in Denmark know, is we try to provide the infrastructure resources, the cost. So you don't have a cost of hosting it, a cost of podcasts, a cost of maintaining the technically software, that sort of thing. But you have complete, as I'm sure Mad in Denmark can say, complete editorial control. Because, and so that's the first thing, complete editorial control in all the affiliates. The second thing is we've tried to, so if you go on Mad in America's front page, we have always articles from around our Mad in the World network. The idea is we can learn from each other. Okay. In other words, you can borrow our content and publish it. And we can also make our readers aware of alternatives, initiatives, stories coming from other countries. And so there's a belief here that A, we can learn from each other, but B, there is so much more strength in a collective voice that has now risen up that can both talk about commonalities, but differences in different cultures, different initiatives. We're going to be at 20 affiliates, I think, by the end of this year. Have a couple more coming online, which is terrific. And I think together, the Mad in the World Network is really having an impact on saying to this larger community, something is wrong with this conventional paradigm of care. We need a new one, a paradigm shift. And by the way, we're seeing this, and some of this does come from Mad in America and Mad in the World. You see that, for example, Danius Puris, the former special rapporteur for health, he says we need a paradigm shift away from this disease model to a human rights model. You see the World Health Organization under the leadership of Michelle Funk saying the same thing. She's put out different guidelines, different documents. I think, Olga, you were a consultant on that, right? One of those documents? So they have actually, both groups used people associated with Mad in America as consultants. They visited some of the alternatives that we had highlighted as promising alternatives, such as the medication-free network in Norway, and such as the Open Dialogue Project, that sort of thing. And by the way, just to give a moment of, I think, of inspiration, there was a meeting in India, I think in 2017, an INTAR meeting put together by, like, there's people from Mad in Ireland that helped put it together, people and others. The group that started Mad in South Asia put it together. It was at that meeting, I was asked to speak, Will Hall was asked to speak, other psychiatric survivors were like to speak, but they also had people from psychiatrists from different areas of the world. And what emerged from that meeting, and there were representatives from the United Nations and the World Health Organization, from Michelle Funk's things, was change comes when you create a new narrative. That's how change happens in society. And out of that sense that this is the critical thing we have to do, you see that emerging from the World Health Organization, you see that emerging from the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Health, and really that is what you see from Mad in the World, that we have this false narrative of science that does harm, and we're a group of collective people saying, let's explore new possibilities, new narratives, new ways of doing it, new conceptions. And last thing, and now I'm going to stop, is, at least in the United States, here's how the narrative is changing even within psychiatry. Leading psychiatrists will say, oh, we never believed in that chemical imbalance story. We always knew it was not true. That's nonsense. American Psychiatric Association was promoting it, but they are admitting that didn't pan out. They're also admitting is that they don't have any evidence that psychiatric drugs improve long-term outcomes. And that actually arose from a couple efforts to show where I was wrong in the anatomy of an epidemic. And they wanted to find, there was a group from Columbia, for example, that evidence that did show that antipsychotics were improving long-term outcomes. They couldn't find it. Now you have, so then you have a famous psychiatrist named Nasagami saying, these drugs should not be used long-term. We have no evidence they're beneficial long-term. We should use them and they don't fix chemical imbalances. We should use them in as short a period of time and as low a period of time as possible. That's a big change. And now, just this past year, we had Dost Unger, editor-in-chief of JAMA Psychiatry, admitting that outcomes for serious mental disorders have gotten worse in the last decades. Functional outcomes, more chronic, that sort of thing. So what you are seeing is a narrative that admits it really hasn't worked out, okay, in any evidence-based way. Now, they don't want to admit the harm done, okay? And they are still clinging to somehow, in general, that the drugs are good, we need it, and we're getting all sort of increased force treatment. But I will tell you, within, that's the public narrative. Within psychiatry's own narrative, there's a lot of admission, acknowledgement that this disease model has failed. The diagnoses haven't been validated as real diseases. The chemical imbalance story is not true. You can read about how the drugs induce changes that are oppositional tolerance that may be causing outcomes to be worse over the long term. and you are hearing more and more like, oh, well, at least we need to move to a holistic form that we do things like diet and housing first and something like that. So change is happening, yet there is, at least in the United States, still a hardy biological narrative. And I will say, if you look at Europe from my point of view, it's a mixed bag. So Norwegian patient groups managed to get this medication-free initiative going in Norway, and it got really sort of going. But Norwegian psychiatry as a whole is very biologically based, and they basically killed that initiative except for tiny little remnants of it. So it's a mixed bag. I know in Denmark, I think you have a pretty vigorous discussion going on. But I also know that Peter Goethe got killed in Denmark. So it's a mixed bag. So anyway, sorry I went on about 10 minutes too long.
Thank you. So, okay, let's get us back to, yes.
So you want to start with some questions from the...
Yes, so we'll start with some questions from the chat. And by the way, if anybody wants to ask questions but want to say it in Danish, I will translate. Så hvis der er nogen, der gerne vil spørge på dansk og sådan, så oversætter jeg gerne. Så I kan sætte håndene op og
Okay.
og I'll put my on mute. Oh, okay.
Because
Great.
otherwise it's going to...
Okay, yeah.
All right.
Mm.
So we have a couple of questions around alternative approaches. You've been mentioning open dialogue and Hearing Voices Network, but Helene is asking, why have the Trieste model and Soteria model been so hard to implement, even though all research has shown that this is what works? And she has another question that's kind of the same theme, that what is the MAD movement stance towards phenomenology, psychopathology? I can't say that. Can you?
Wait. Phenomenology and psychopathology.
My experience is that these two has to contribute together, and there's lots of room for dialogue, especially with the things that are happening in England, like the Epistemic Injustice Project in Birmingham.
Mm. Oh,
So those are two great questions. First, the Soteria. There's two reasons. There's two reasons that Soteria almost completely disappeared, but it's starting to reappear. But why it's so hard? One is the original Soteria project that was done by Lauren Mosher in the United States, ran from 10 years. And they found with their model of care, which was you had people with psychotic symptoms, just living with other ordinary people, by the way, not medical professionals. Okay, it was ordinary people. And it was basically, the idea was to be there, you had to be okay with people in extreme states, that you wouldn't freak out. That really was sort of the job description, okay? And it was led by a very important, and I think this is part of the thing. The Soteria House was led for 10 years by Voice Hendricks, who was the cousin of Jimi Hendrix. And one of the things is he was a great leader for Soteria House. He was a big man. He also was a man that when you met him, when you said, wow, I'm a pretty cool person because he likes me. He was a very warm person, and you wanted to be liked by him. So his presence really helped set a tone in that house that worked. They had very little problems with violence, that sort of thing. And it was a study, and they had better outcomes at 2 years, okay? And they had selective use of drugs. There were some people who never needed to go on the drugs, sort of like an open dialogue. Some people need them temporarily, and some people need to be on them continually. Much more likely, and there was a randomized arm where the other group was treated conventionally. So lower symptomatology, better social functioning. And here's what American psychiatry said. Okay, you've proved your point, and now, Lauren, leave. He got fired. Okay? And the reason he got fired because it was such a challenge to everything psychiatry was doing. It was saying like ordinary people in a house can do better than a hospital with its drugs. So that was a thing that made it clear to American psychiatrists, don't go against this or you'll be pushed out, okay? And you have to realize, though, in terms of its spread, it was not a disease model, okay? It was a model that said environments count. Environments can be healing. And so what is the role of psychiatrists in that environment? Well, you can have a role as a prescriber of antipsychotics on a selective use model. That's fine. But you're not in the position of authority as this is our domain of authority. Okay? So that's why I think it didn't get a hold of, in large part, because we went so big in the disease model, the biological model, the drug use model, okay? So much so that not giving antipsychotics came to be seen as medically negligent in certain situations. And the one tiny corner that persisted, of course, was in Tornio, Finland, where they kept up that model of selective use. I think that still holds today, explains why you have trouble getting these started, because there's a lot of resistance to that form of care. However, and it's odd in the sense of what's going on politically, Israel did move down that route of opening up Soteria houses as first-line therapy. And it goes back to the 2017, I think, actually. And there were two parts to it. There was an American-born psychiatrist who knew Lauren Mosher, who had a job in Pesach-Lichtenberg when the atypical antipsychotics came in saying, we need to use these drugs, okay? That was his job at the Ministry of Health. But then he found that they really weren't working. He knew Lauren Mosher, and he began campaigning for a Soteria house that would use drugs in a selective use model and choice, that sort of thing. And then there was a man that read Anatomy of an Epidemic. He was a wealthy person. His son had a break after serving in the military. You know, everyone's conscripted there. And he flew over to Boston, and he said, because his son was now seen as schizophrenic, okay? He had the psychotic break. And he said, is it possible my son could get better off the drugs? And I said, yes. And his family spent a year getting off the drugs, and now his son was fine and went on to a great career. So he joined forces to help create the Soteria houses in Israel. Now, they brought me over there a couple of times to make an evidence-based case for it in front of them. The Ministry of Health actually brought me over. I will say that Israel's psychiatry as a whole, especially those in from Eastern European, trashed me. It was really quite brutal. And just were really awful. That's the only way to put it. But on the other hand, there was this core of sort of progressive Western trained psychiatrists that were behind this, Pesach-Lichtenberg. And Israel's a small country. This particular family had a lot of influence. It was a long-time family influence. And they had one other thing going for them, for why the Soteria got established there. And they either call them equilibrium houses or Soteria houses. Everybody in Israel gets conscripted, right? And they have to spend a year in the military. And so often what happened is they do this after high school, and then they would spend a year away wandering. They do drugs so much, and they'd have so many problems with kids getting psychotic episodes. They actually had teams that would go to other countries and pull those kids out and bring them back. Because those kids came from the military through this service route, they didn't see them as chronically ill, but they saw them as people that had been traumatized by their service. So that image of trauma actually informed their adoption of Soteria houses, because the Soteria house conception was these can be episodic. So what in essence developed in Israel was a two-pronged thing where even as a first line of therapy, at least I last knew, it's Soteria houses or equilibrium houses. But then if people, I guess, are sort of too difficult, they may end up getting shuttled off into the conventional hospitals. But that's the place you actually see it, and and now the politics around that is just so awful. But there is still an existing Soteria program in Israel that exists, and has shown that you can work in this way. I visited the Soteria houses; they were great. People were active, fun to be with. Yeah, they were psychotic. I'll give you a real quick example. I'm sorry to do this, but I have to give a quick example how they treated people in like Soteria Jerusalem. There was one woman there that had suffered terrible sexual abuse, sexual assaults, that sort of thing, which is, of course, quite common among women who, well, particularly women who end up with a psychotic diagnosis. So she comes to this house and she thinks she has her own bedroom. She thinks she's getting raped every night. That's her thought. So what they said is, they didn't say that's not happening. They said, can you find a safe space in this house? So the woman found a safe space in the house, and that delusion, that thought, disappeared. And so that was an example of how to respond in a non-medical way. We do have a couple Soteria houses now. We have one in Vermont that started up. And again, it started up after, frankly, that I gave a talk to the health department in Vermont, and they said, oh, there's an evidence-based reason for it. It's been existing now for 10 years, more than 10 years, I think, doing fine, shows that they can work. There's one going to start up in New Mexico. There may even be one in New York, but why don't we have more? Because they don't fit into the disease model, the health insurance model. When the health insurance model is stabilize them, send them out, and that's what we'll pay for. So, and it's and by the way, Soteria also means like it's not a 2-week thing, right? It takes time. I mean, boy, you've been working in this way for a long time, right? In your corner of Denmark, it's not 2 weeks, right? So that's why it doesn't happen also. So that was a long answer. Now the second question about phenomenology. Yes, because phenomenology puts people into where you're talking about how the mind arises in response to the environment. In all parts of the environment, whether it be food or whether it be social, standing in environments, whether you're facing poverty, racism, that sort of thing. And also what I love about phenomenology is it's humble. We don't know the answers. The human mind is a mystery, right? And by the way, it binds people. A phenomenological conception doesn't draw a line between those who are normal and those who are abnormal. We all exist in a phenomenological space. So yeah, I think actually phenomenology is in fact a conception, a philosophy of being that is such a great antidote to the disease model, and a necessary one.
Thank you, Bob. And then I can see outside got your hand up there. So pop your microphone on. Yeah.
So I like your point about creating a new narrative, and I'd like you to expand on that. And what you said reminded me of Buckminster Fuller's famous word that you don't get anywhere by critiquing the existing model. Go someplace else and build a new model. And I'd like to hear what would be your take on what are the various strands or what are the various aspects that you'd like to build into a new model to replace the disease model of mental illness? How would we conceive of health and mental health and disease in different and better terms? You've indicated phenomenology, and that's one great strand, but please say more.
Well, I think this is such a great question. And I couldn't agree more that things change when you have a new narrative that people can grab onto, that resonates with them, and resonates as true to them, to their life's experiences too, as well. And before I give my personal opinion, one of the thoughts is that what we're doing at Mad in America and Mad in the world is providing a forum for the creation of that new narrative and what it should look like. Because I think it's not going to come from an individual. It's going to come from like this group thinking and that sort of thing. But what do I think is a narrative we need? We need a philosophy of being that is robust and is consonant with what we know from literature, from religious tracts, and our own lives. And what that is a philosophy of being. It's difficult. It's difficult growing up. You have to grapple with your mind and the sort of currents that course through your mind. And that's part of the fundamental part of being a human being, is trying to grapple with our emotions, with our thoughts, with our instincts, our jealousies, that sort of thing. So we need a philosophy that shows that life can be difficult, suffering can be normal. Given right conditions, any of us can go psychotic, any of us can go manic. These are experiences, possibilities that exist within the human spectrum. So first of all, it's a philosophy of being, okay? A much more complex one that we can see in literature over and over again. I often joke, read your Shakespeare. How many normal people do you read in the Shakespeare? Okay, just read your Shakespeare. That would be a good start. But then also, so that's a start. Second is to understand that we're not steady state creatures, right? We have times of depression. We have times of happiness. We're like this, okay? We're very emotional creatures. We grieve, we're jealous, but we have to understand that psychiatric difficulties that get labeled today as a diagnosis, they can be temporary, episodic, and obviously a response to the environment. So once we have that conception that we human beings are built by evolution to be responsive to our environment, from the moment we exit the womb, right? We look at faces and that sort of thing. If we know we're built to be responsive to the environment, what should we be doing? Well, we should be building better environments, right? First of all, environments that are just more healthy for everybody. Now, we're doing a really shitty job at that in the United States now, right? In terms of poverty, inequality, cruelty, it's just it's really becoming a very cruel place to sort of, a narrative exists that is cruel. But if we understand that conception, there's two parts to that. One, if we want to help people, kids and all, try to create good environments for them. Okay, like help kids play, help kids be curious. There's a program in the United States called the Nurtured Heart approach. They bring it into schools. They've done research. Rather than labeling the kids with ADHD, they try to change the environment of the classroom so kids want to be there. Curiosity is rewarded. They help them teach to cook, okay, learn about food, that sort of thing. And rather than a narrative that says, oh, you got to be so competitive and like, it's a dog eat dog world. It's about, how can we help each other, that sort of thing, learn from each other. And then if someone does fall into this difficult time, we need to know environment matters. It matters in terms of restoring your health as well, path to healing. And what do we know? Well, diet's important. Meaning in life is important, right? Having someone to love, someone to love you, all the social connections are so important. So there's a very nice book out called The Connection Cure about prescribing, okay, help this person join a bowling league or a hiking group or that sort of thing to get them able to be with others. So it's sort of a non-therapeutic response in many ways. It's not fixing inside the head. It's providing people with housing, meaning, etc. And I'll give you an example by this. There's a psychotherapist in Connecticut who runs something called Volunteers for Psychotherapy. And it's people, poor people, come out of hospitals. He'll meet with them 1 hour a week for free. But what those people have to do to pay for this is volunteer. So they might volunteer at an animal shelter. They might volunteer bringing food to the elderly. And what does the volunteering give them? Well, they're no longer the person being helped all the time. They're helping others. And they can go out and someone says, what do you do? Oh, well, I bring food to the elderly. So they're giving a person a different identity other than the mental patient, I'm chronically ill identity. So that's my opinion, but you can see how it does fit with the phenomenological approach. But it really is, it starts with, we need to say, what does it mean to be human? That's where it begins. And I think what it means to be human is we are built to be responsive to our environments. And so you need to improve your environments, and that given healthy environments, boy, humans can be so resilient. But final thing is, that's part of Mad and World's mission, is to come up with a new narrative.
Exactly.
And promote it.
Exactly. Yes. We're going to sort of alternate between the hands and the written ones.
Yeah, so we've got a question from the chat. Unfortunately, Joan had to go, the one who posted, but we'll go into it anyway. So she was asking, where did the "you have no insight into your own illness" originally come from? It's used in Denmark as a method of effectively removing the patient's civil rights. We are, by law, allowed a significant measure of involvement in our own treatment process in this country, but as soon as a psychiatrist utters the words, "Du har ingen sygdomsindsigt," which is the Danish direct translation of that expression, they have effectively barred you from having any say in what is being done to you. It has happened to me in the past, and it wasn't until years later I was informed that my rights had been comprehensively trampled upon.
Mm.
Well, this person has identified where it came from.
Mm.
It came from basically within psychiatry as part of their disease model, really to promote it.
Mm.
And here's the evidence they gave. So if you're saying that people need the drugs and they're helpful, they're curative. If someone says, I don't like the drugs, not helpful, in your own mind, you might say, well, they don't even know they're sick, right? They don't accept that they're being sick. They lack insight into their illness.
Mm.
And they had this evidence to sort of support that thought. They would run studies where they took people who had responded well to antipsychotics. Now, that's a subset of all people, right? And often even just for a shorter period of time. And then what they would do is they would do a randomized study where they took one half of the people immediately off the drug, and the other half stayed on the drug that they had already responded well to. And with great regularity, the people taken off the drug relapsed at a higher rate. And they said, oh, see, the disease returns. Now, they wouldn't even acknowledge that it's a withdrawal effect, okay? And even that the whole thing by design makes no sense, because you're only doing this in a subset of patients that are good responders, okay? It's a scientifically invalid design. But they use that to go to the public to say, look, what happens if these people don't take the drugs? They relapse, and then if someone ever does any sort of crime or during that stage, they say, see what happens? They cause violence, okay? And so we need to force medication on them because it's good for them and it protects the public security. Now, that's the rationale for it. And so they have to deny the person their own lived experience, their own experience of these drugs, in order to maintain that force, that authority. And by the way, it does make psychiatrists powerful in our society. They have authority over human beings, right? Now, this, by the way, that's what was, when I talked about doing that series for the Boston Globe in 1998. I went to people and I said, after I initially talked to the psychiatrists, they say these drugs are like insulin for diabetes. Schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine. Then I said, but wait a minute. I talked to David Oakes and other people, and they say they hate these drugs. Why do they hate these drugs if they're so good for them? And they said, oh, that's because they lack insight into their illness. And that was my moment that I said, this is not good. This is the powerful saying that they know better what's good for the people who they're forcing this treatment on. So this was really a moment that I began questioning, the authority of psychiatry when it said that people didn't want to take the drugs lacked insight, especially when they talked about feeling like zombies, like it caused Parkinson-like symptoms. They lost their emotions. That obviously were effects that people wouldn't like, right? Akathisia, etc. So that's where it comes from. By the way, there was a study recently that looked at people who didn't want to take the drugs and managed not to take the drugs and were seen as having anosognosia. Now, they had better outcomes, the people who stopped taking the drugs. That happens over and over again. It happened in your Danish study, Opus, right? Wasn't that a Danish study?
Yes,
the people who did best were the people who got off the medications, who were not medication compliant. I think it was 125 of the 300 and some at the end of 10 years who got off. And by far, they had the higher recovery rates, better functioning rates, lower disability rates. But in this particular study, you know what they concluded? Even though the people with anosognosia had better outcomes, they needed to work harder to force people to take their medications, because that group would have done even better if they had not stopped taking their medication. It was the most ludicrous thing. But I just want to say to this person is, you can see I get riled up about the forced treatments.
Yeah.
Forced treatment is taking people's right to be the authors of their own lives, who haven't been found guilty of a crime. It's taking that away from them. And in the United States, what we're doing now is not only are we forcing people into the hospital, now when you come out, we have these assisted outpatient treatment, which basically puts you under orders to take the medication even after you leave, and you have trouble getting out of that order. So this is an expansion of that oppression, which is the worst, because it is taking away people's right to be the authors of their own lives. And frankly, because of the drugs, experience the full range of possibilities and emotions that come with not being on those drugs. So it's a bullshit story that came up by psychiatrists to defend their narrative about the merits of the drugs. And you have forced electroshock in Denmark?
Yes, we do. And we use it a lot.
That. We have forced electroshock in the United States. Anyway, it's just part of the forced treatment that is so wrong. And you say the same thing, they lack insight into their illness, and that's why they need to be forcibly treated with electroshock.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more with your words. Helene.
Oh, hello again. Thank you for your talk, Robert, and thank you for all the work you have done. And I actually came through phenomenology, through the Mad movement, sort of the other way around. I got opportunities there, which was quite interesting because I've also been diagnosed with schizophrenia in the 90s, and I went through the whole universal mill of lack of insight and forced treatment and all the horror. I've been an artist my entire life as a choreographer, and an interesting thing, choreographers and artists learn to live in chaos, so we don't see it as something bad. So I already knew that it was the psychiatrist that was more afraid of madness than I was. And it's interesting now, I talk at conferences, and I still meet very young psychiatrists that are actually quite open-minded. And we sit in a social situation, and they know my story, and they say like, okay, so do you take medication today? I said, no, I haven't done that for many, many years. And they said, oh, but then you can't be schizophrenic. Then your diagnosis must be wrong. And I'm sort of sitting like, and I'm trying to be really patient. having broad shoulders, trying to explain what it is, and some of them totally get flabbergasted. And there's also the problem of what they teach in medical school. So there's, as you know, there's so many structural, hierarchical, political, neoliberalism, and all that kind of stuff. So it's quite interesting how much that is ingrained also in very young doctors that actually are the ones that are most outspoken about their own symptoms. And I'm also thinking about the new talks that is in phenomenology is taking the part of the, revelations and all this kind of thing you have in psychosis and incorporating, having new science on that. But they're really reaching out to the East because they know Western part, we still have this kind of duality of thinking. And it's really interesting for me. I had to escape to Great Britain to do work because, everyone still thinks I'm crazy. If I do something, and, I had to take all these academic, if anyone wants to listen to my voice, that's still the dilemma, I have to do all this. I don't care about prestige or anything, but I still have to speak with the right voices. And if someone says I'm a doctor, a PhD, then, oh, she must be clever. So that's also that dilemma of that voice being heard. I think, I'm sorry, I'm just commenting, but I think it's really interesting what's going on. And I really feel like you say there is a lot of movements going on that, and especially also I think the neurodiversity movement and all the, it's beginning to come up in CRIP and disability studies. It's actually beginning to sneak in Denmark a little bit, I can see. So yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, it was just me babbling.
So two things real quickly.
Thank you.
Can I just respond real quickly to one thing?
Of course, please.
You said that they say, oh, you couldn't have schizophrenia, right? They say this because they want to defend their disease model, which says you're always going to have schizophrenia.
Yeah.
What happens is someone is well and off medication, they don't see that as a part. Since they're being taught that you have to be on the medication, then they say, well, the only way you could be off and okay is if you didn't have it in the first place, which of course is nonsense. And if you know the research literature, and first of all, the diagnosis is given to so many different types of people, et cetera, like this. But if you go back to even say 1945 to 1955 in the United States, you know what percent, this is before antipsychotics arrived. Do you know what percentage of first episode schizophrenia patients would be working and 5 years later and out in the community without drugs? 2/3. 65, 70%. This is before the drugs. So, but they use this idea with as a way to defend their conventional narrative of again. Okay. The other thing I want to notice, there was this really interesting study in the 1970s where they compared psychotherapy without medication and psychotherapy with medication. And at the end of 1 year, the group, and it was done by the NIMH, at the end of 1 year, the group that didn't have medication was doing better, functioning better, less depression, that sort of thing, lower relapse. But then they asked the patients what it was like to go through that, because they were having psychotic symptoms, experiencing psychosis, whatever you want to call it. What was it like to have that and go through that without meds? And here's what they said. It's really interesting. Oh, it was hard. It was painful. But they said they felt grateful that they were able to still have their emotions available to them as they work through this, if you want to call it, time in their lives. And and some of them would, I think part of it, and you also see this from open dialogue, some people, as they get better, they're still hearing voices, right? Or they may still sometimes have crazy thoughts, but it's okay. They've learned how to function with it in society and that sort of thing. But anyway, to say what you're saying is, the very thing what you're saying is that in the studies, it showed that having your faculties fully there can be helpful, even though it can be painful.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, thank you. We have
another
one going to the
question from Lucif. He's asking, or they're asking, can you or anyone else recommend a book on the psychiatric paradigms in Europe? looking around the room here. Seeing if,
Well, you know, of course, you know, Sammy Tamimi has written some really good, you know, the UK psychiatrist. He's written some really good stuff about the paradigm and how it doesn't hold up and how we need a new paradigm. He's a child psychiatrist, but he's also he's a very easy person to read. You know, at Mad in America, we published Peter Ghosh's work.
Yeah, and Pernille here is just suggesting Models of Madness by John Reed
and Jackie Dillon.
Yeah, that's good too. I mean, I think in a way, there's a number of books you can read it published in Europe, like 3 or 4 that are all challenging that conventional narrative, but from different sort of perspectives and different experiences. You know, Peter comes from it from a very sort of, you know, I was a researcher and analyzing evidence basis. Sammy, you know, he's a practicing UK psychiatrist, but he's seen how the diagnoses don't fit and that sort of thing. Joanna Moncrief has some good stuff. And what I do say, it's great to get a mix of, if you want to read about this, also books by people with lived experience too. So we can hear, you can see how the narrative fit with people who were treated within that narrative and how they escaped that narrative, that sort of thing. So rather than one book, I think if you could, there's probably 4 or 5 books that you can point out. And maybe what Mad in Denmark can do is put up a list of books they would recommend.
Yeah, we can do that. I have a whole library of books that collected over the years. Have a look at them.
And we were just talking, it could also be a possibility for people to write it in the comment.
Yeah, any books.
If you have suggestions to share.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. And again, anybody who wants to, if you're shy about speaking English, I'll translate. If you want to speak directly.
And someone already did write that there's a full list of books on the A Disorder for Everyone's site in A4E.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's the UK one. That's run by Joe Watson and Jackie Dillon.
We have a question here.
Yes.
We have a question from outside.
Good.
Yes, if I may.
Of course.
My question concerns narratives and the new narrative. When discussing these psychiatric pharmaceuticals with lay people and people who are prescribed these medications and psychiatrists in training, I often encounter the argument that sometimes sedation is a necessity or a net positive. So that very quickly extrapolates to the conclusion that medication is good. And it's and I've on several occasions found myself stuck in a very complex debate as a consequence. So I would like to ask the author how to navigate that situation. Do you have any experience?
Well, I think if you have a conception of drugs having an action like that, sedation, rather than fixing a known pathology, they can have a use. You can help people sleep sometimes. Sometimes can you restore sleep can be helpful. Sometimes a sedation can be helpful if you're just suffering too many, painful emotions, painful experiences, that sort of thing. It's clearly not a solution, a permanent solution. We're not going to keep someone sedated forever. But I think that conception of medications, can they have an effect like sedation or perhaps a stimulant that in a time of need, that they can be useful? Like benzodiazepines can be useful on a short-term basis. Like some people can't fly without them. Okay, fine. Take a benzodiazepine and your anxiety will be lowered for a period of time. So I think, and if you look at Open Dialogue, how they used antipsychotics. Initially, they tried not to use the antipsychotics, But then after time, if a person wasn't getting better, they would try to use a low dose to help them stabilize and maybe take away some of the pain. And then of those who were exposed, they would like to see who could come off and who basically, for whatever reason, did better on them long term. And they ended up at the end of 5 years, as practiced in Tornio, that 67% of their patients never went on the drugs, 13% used them for a time, and 20% were maintained on the drugs long term. So to me, they found a way to treat newly psychotic people in a way that maximized their long-term outcomes and did find some use for the drugs. So, and I think that should be part of the narrative, but I do think the narrative should be exactly what you're talking about. Not as things that fix something, but as sort of a crutch that may be useful for a time. And then there's maybe some people that need that crutch for forever. I don't know. But I think you have to open yourself up to the possibility that some people, for whatever reason, this is what they found in Tornio, did need to be on the drugs long term. And it did show up in the Soteria project as well. You'd still try to use them at lower doses and, that sort of thing, and with consent and all that. But I think your question is important because in a new narrative, I still think there is a place, I think, for the use of medications. It's just a different place.
And not forced.
So we've got...
And not forced. Right.
No, not forced. Yeah.
Yeah. So someone suggesting a question to outsider, was that an answer to your confusion?
In the middle of drinking cola.
Thank you for the answer. That was quite good.
Fine, thank you. So we've got a comment here from Felicia, and then a question from Marianne. I'll do both of them. So the comment from Felicia is, I'm the COB of the Swedish NGO nonprofit Context, and I'm an ecotherapist exploring environment and its impact on people. It contains connection, embodiment, embedment, or emplacement. I don't have a question. I only want to say that I'm very happy to hear about the emphasis on environment. I'm, however, looking for connections myself to try to do something here in Sweden. And then there's a question, or a comment and a question from Marianne. Maybe we should look to post-structuralism and indigenous methodologies for inspiration in relation to epistemic injustice, but also hermeneutic injustice and even contributory injustice. I'm getting challenged again. In relation to Helene's comments about structures. What do you think about this, Robert? And thank you very much for sharing all your experience and work.
Well, listen, when I think that we're at this last question about indigenous ways of doing things, we have a failed paradigm of care that was exported around the world, right? And once you understand that, the next thing is, well, who can we learn from, right? What are some of the approaches? Now, two things. Remember that was World Health Organization studies? They found best outcomes in India and Nigeria. Particularly in rural India and rural Nigeria, okay, outside the cities. Now, they were diagnosed by Western doctors, so this wasn't a question of diagnostic differences. But for example, in India, where they had, I think was in, what was the name of the small town? Anyway, they went back 15 years later and interviewed people in the original studies, in all the different sites. And one of the things that in India, for example, the people, when they wanted to interview them, said, okay, I can give you 2 hours, but I also work. I'm working in the fields and whatever. So just through that glimpse of things that you saw in this rural community where the people weren't sort of expelled and made the other and isolated, but still had a place in society, that became a path towards, better long-term outcome. We'll use the language of this. That's number one. Number two, Mad in South Asia published a beautiful piece, I don't know if you republished it, about faith healing sites in India. And one of the reasons they said is, okay, the medical model, the disease model has taken over Indian psychiatry, but so many of the people, they don't want that. Okay, they want to go back to like their sort of faith healing, which is obviously bringing in spirits, that sort of thing. And they did a video that is so, now what happens was there was criticism of faith healing sites, and they sort of got banned for psychiatric patients in India because Indian psychiatry said, oh, that's horrible, you're mistreating people. But they took a video, so people still go to the sites and they're outside. And you see people that are, you know, clearly psychotic, lost, that sort of thing. But what's so interesting, families are around them and kids are around them and no one's bothered when you see this. So there's this environment outside the healing site where the person that is, who we would identify as having schizophrenia, is still accepted within that milieu. And with kids and not being feared and that sort of thing. So this is to say we can learn from indigenous people. I've had two personal experiences where I think learning from indigenous people can be so powerful. One was I used to live next to a man from Cameroon who came from a tribe where his family was the rulers. And he spent time working with the cure of what they called the sickheads. And how did they treat them within this tribal environment in Cameroon? Well, first of all, every year they had a parade, and those people led the parade and they were celebrated. Second of all, they all had a place, like selling, maybe making soup, that sort of thing. So in other words, they still treated them as members of the tribe. They weren't expelled from the tribe. In a way, and under the disease model, you're expelled from the tribe. Mm. And finally, I had the opportunity to spend some time in the Upper Amazon with an indigenous society that had an animist philosophy of being. In other words, an animist meaning like your ancestors may live in a tree called the cebu tree, and monkeys may live beneath the ground. It's a very sort of rich thing. And I'll never forget when I was there, some of the people spoke Spanish and they said, you know, they looked at a cebu tree, which extends beyond the rest of the trees. It's this majestic tree, and that's where their ancestors live. And they said to me, so, you know, we see our ancestors living in there when we look at the tree. What do you see? And I said, well, unfortunately, I just see a tree that's sort of exceptional in this. It's a little bit taller than the rest of the trees. And they sort of shook their head with great sympathy for for my blindness in the world, that I couldn't see the richness. Anyway, they did have a person during this time who we would call depressed. Now, how did they interpret it? They interpreted it that they were out of sync with their ancestors. So they had a ceremony, and yes, with ayahuasca. And during the night of that ceremony, what happened is there was a gust of wind that entered the hut. And that was the moment that this person realized the ancestors were coming back to be with her for a time. So that through that ceremony, she felt rejoined with her ancestors, reunited with her ancestors. So your question was, what can we learn from indigenous things? We can learn a lot from indigenous peoples, right? Their rituals, their methods for helping keep the tribe intact. So yes, I always wondered why, after the World Health Organization, why didn't we learn what they were doing right? You know, what was working in rural India was working in rural Nigeria. But of course, Western medicine is so haughty and so arrogant that it's like, oh, we can't learn anything from them.
Yeah. Well, I put my hand up, Bob, because I was wondering about the Odessi trial. There's a rumor that the results are going to be quite good. The one, I don't know if the one on open dialogue in the UK.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what you know, let's say it was really good news. What do you think it can change anything?
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm thinking. Yeah.
Because in particular, since it was done within a regular health setting, you know, so that they sort of dismissed Tornio as, oh, those crazy people in Western Lapland, it was special. It's sort of, so this shows it could be done within a conventional developed setting, right? The UK. I'll be very curious to know what is their medication use in that trial, because they weren't nearly as adamant. Generally, as it got exported, they didn't really export the selective use model that was so dominant in Northern Finland. Listen, I would expect better outcomes just from treating people as human beings.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
And bringing them, trying to help them form alliances. And if you can get down to lower doses, that's great. So I would expect better outcomes just from that. And, you know, probably talking about, you know, helping people rejoin, you know, their family situations, different situations. So I hope it's great. And I think it could it could have a lot of influence, sure.
Yeah.
The only reason you hear my hesitation is sometimes, yeah, they'll just sort of say, oh, yeah, that's great. And then they won't actually embrace it. You know what I mean? The powers that be. But let's hope the results are great. And if so, let's do everything we can in Mad in the world to promote those results.
Yeah. Well, that should be coming soon. We hear that it's coming here in December, January. So
wow, I didn't know it was that close. That's fantastic.
Yeah. Yes, and we will be, of course, I've just in my ear here been told we'll be publishing them. So, but I'm sure the UK will be publishing because it's in the UK too. But we'll certainly try.
But this is something that should be should be like
all over
on all the Mad in the World sites. That here are the results.
Yeah, exactly. No, this should be big news.
Well, that's encouraging.
Yes. Yeah.
So any other questions?
Anybody going to? Yeah. So any more questions or anything? Because otherwise, I was thinking we can. Let me just see. Start to. Maybe.
Can you hear me from here?
I'm going to try and turn.
No.
No. Oh, okay. Well, our team here. Yes.
I see far too late back here. Well, it was just the thing about, you know, drugs, and I just wanted to nuance it a little bit. Of course, as you're also doing always, Bob, of course, it needs to be, if you want to do the drugs yourself, if you want to take them yourself, it's always from the perspective of the person and if it's helpful for the person.
Can I say one thing? That's a great point.
Yes.
It's because it honors choice. And the only thing I would say is it should be done within the arena of informed consent.
Yes.
Informed consent of what we know about how the medications are acting, and also what we know possibly about long-term outcomes. But obviously, absolutely, if they find them helpful, that's great. Right?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking maybe everyone can come on their screens if you want to. Just kind of nice to see, just rather than list. But if you want to,
and can I just recommend people to look in the chat, because there are different links and suggestions and information about me coming to Denmark. So please look there as well.
Yeah. So, are we finishing? Do you think?
Jamen, det er mig, der er Anna Ingeborg. Jeg vil bare gerne sige tusind tak for jeres deltagelse og jeres bidrag til samtalen. Det har været lærerigt både for os alle sammen, og jeg håber, I også er blevet klogere på, hvad Mad in Danmark og Mad in the World er for noget. I kan selvfølgelig følge med på hjemmesiden og på Facebook og LinkedIn. Og I er også alle sammen velkomne til at bidrage til Mad in Danmark. Vi er jo en lille gruppe med nogle travle medlemmer, så derfor tager vi gerne imod alle bidrag, vi kan få udefra. Og det kan være idéer, tekster, kunst og bare alle jeres perspektiver. Så det er altid velkomment. Så jeg vil bare sige tusind tak for i aften, og fortsat god aften til jer alle sammen.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's a real opportunity and pleasure. And Mad in Denmark is such an important part, and it's doing great stuff. So really glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bob.
Thank you,
my dearest friend. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
All right. We'll be in touch.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Yeah.